For those of you who aren't familiar with the Personalized Medicine Coalition, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to us, and then I'm going to quickly turn it over to the panelists for a discussion on LDTs. But the Personalized Medicine Coalition is based here in Washington. We've been around for the last 16 years, and really we have a membership that's representative of the entire healthcare spectrum. So everything from research and clinical care organizations to large and small biopharma companies, diagnostic companies, trade associations, patients, and we have individual patients as members, patient advocacy groups, payer, IT companies, as well as other strategic partners. And really our goal is to broadly focus on both education, advocacy, and evidence development that helps move the field forward in several ways. And I feel fortunate to have the opportunity to work with the group who's assembled up here today on federal policy activities that really are intended to both support the industry as well as improve patient care. So what we're going to do, because we don't have even a full hour to focus on the history of the oversight and regulatory activities that have happened in the last decade or so related to LDTs and how that's evolved, we are going to look at one specific legislative proposal, the VALID Act, the Verifying Accurate Leading Edge IVCT Development Act. And really, that's something that was put forward in December by Representative Larry Bouchon from Louisiana and Congresswoman Diana DeGette from Colorado. And it established a point of discussion for a new framework for diagnostic oversight. I know that many of the organizations who are up here have differing views on that legislation, and we've all worked together and independently to provide feedback to those offices and ways that we might work toward a proposal that supports most people's views on what needs to be taken forward. But I think the one thing we can agree on is that any new framework really needs to be both supportive of being able to incorporate scientific advancement and flexible enough to accommodate how quickly that pace changes. So I'm going to stop talking, and I feel very lucky to have the opportunity to sit up here today with these wonderful people. And I'm just going to go quickly down the line and ask everyone to introduce themselves, their organization, and talk a little bit about how they've been working to move the discussion along both on Capitol Hill related to VALID and then generally diagnostics reform. So Julie, I'll turn it over to you.
Right. I guess I'm going to be first on a lot of these things since I'm sitting next to Cynthia. I'm Julie Khani. I'm the president of the American Clinical Laboratory Association. Thanks so much for the opportunity to join you today. ACLA is a trade association representing labs. Our membership is diverse. We have national labs such as LabCorp, and I'm happy to share the stage with Don. Today, regional labs, hospital and specialty labs, nursing homes, ESRD labs, and AP labs. So really a very wide and diverse group. I will say as an aside that genomic health and exact sciences are within the ACLA membership, and I always thought of them as incredible innovators rather than one-trick ponies, but I'm a little biased, I guess, there. There are certainly a tremendous number of public policy issues facing labs in DC, and I think the diagnostics community in general. For ACLA, our top priorities are reform of the Protecting Access to Medicare Act and the clinical laboratory reimbursement provisions in there. We're very aggressively representing our members on the Hill, before the administration, and in the courts to make sure that that is ultimately implemented in a way that results in sustainable market-based pricing for labs, which was the intent of Congress. Our second priority and the focus of the panel today, of course, is moving forward for a legislative solution to comprehensive reform for clinical laboratory diagnostics. And that includes, of course, both LDTs and IVD diagnostics as well. And did you want me to jump into—
That would be great, yeah.
Sort of what we're doing, certainly. We're working with a lot of the folks here on this stage and as well as folks in this room. I would say that VALID is certainly not a final product. It's the next step in a multi-year process. It's a discussion draft. It's not actually introduced legislation at this time. So a couple of things that ACLA has done is first to be very, very engaged in that opportunity to provide comments. We've provided very, very detailed comments on every version. We want to be an information source and a resource, not just for the Hill, but also for the broader stakeholder community. I mentioned we worked very, very closely with folks here. We're part of a group of stakeholders that represents and includes labs as well as diagnostic manufacturers, patient groups, and others to press for, again, that legislative solution, that you need a diagnostic-specific framework, and we really encourage the Hill to move forward with that.
Great. Thank you. Susan?
Good afternoon. I'm Susan Van Meter. I'm the Executive Director of AdvaMedDx. AdvaMedDx is a division of the Advanced Medical Technology Association, or AdvaMed. AdvaMedDx has a membership of about 65 in vitro diagnostic manufacturers. We represent those companies in the US and globally. And it's really a broad membership within IVDs. We have small IVD companies, and we have members that have IVD portfolios as part of a much larger medtech organization. We are run by a board of 20 individual CEOs of those companies, and they drive an agenda that includes issues on payment and coverage within Medicare and private payers. I'd like to echo Julie's comments about the importance of PAMA. And we've appreciated ACLA's leadership in seeking redress through administrative, legal, and legislative channels. We're happy to be supportive partners there and are hopeful that we'll see some positive change within coming months to improve PAMA rates. We also prioritize, obviously, diagnostics regulatory reform. We have long stood for legislation that would be comprehensive, risk-based approach that would allow there to be a diagnostic-specific framework that would be predictable to allow for innovation in a way that we think would bring innovative tests to patients much more quickly than today. Our engagement with the Hill, with the agency, and with many stakeholders who are here. As Julie mentioned, we do participate in a broad stakeholder group that meets fairly regularly, a lot of laboratories, IVD manufacturers, some hospital labs, and patient groups, and friends, of course. As part of that group. We have taken the opportunity to provide a lot of feedback to the Hill on that VALID discussion draft. It was released last December, and we've provided really extensive comments and red line to the Hill, to the 4 offices. We're appreciative of their bipartisan, bicameral leadership on this important issue. We're continuing to engage and look forward to more discussions with the Hill in order to move the VALID package forward. We think there are some significant areas where there are improvements that can be made, and we look forward to that process moving within the next few months.
Tara?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Tara. Can you guys hear me? Okay. I'm Tara Burke. I'm the Senior Director of Public Policy and Advocacy at the Association for Molecular Pathology. We are a professional society, and we have 3 main content arms, one of those being advocacy, the other 2 being education, as well as clinical practice. So we have a number of education initiatives, online webinars, and annual meeting to help our members further their practice. Additionally, within the clinical practice arm of AMP, that program works to provide publication standards for the community as well. And our members are diverse. They are physicians, doctoral scientists, technologists, and trainees who work or are involved in laboratory molecular medicine. And that is across the board, from infectious diseases, oncology, as well as inherited conditions. And they practice at a variety of settings: academic medical centers, community hospitals, reference laboratories, as well as the in vitro diagnostics industry. And with regards to VALID, we've been very actively engaged. We really appreciate that the co-sponsors are taking a very open position to receiving stakeholder feedback from all stakeholders, and that has not always been the case. So we were very appreciative of that, and we remain engaged with them on a number of levels. We want to ensure that they understand how laboratory-developed testing procedures are performed within the laboratory and the nuances that go with that. So one of those key aspects is, with regards to VALID, understanding what is proposed or within the discussion draft, how that aligns or does not align or is duplicative to the way that laboratories currently are regulated under CLIA. And that has been one of our main focus, to provide that information to the Hill. And just as an aside, in addition to the regulatory considerations with VALID, which we remain actively engaged, that is done through our Professional Relations Committee, and there are some of those members here today. And then with regards to reimbursement, which we are also very heavily engaged on PAMA, as well as considerations with the NCD process, coding, and other aspects of coverage. That is done by our Economic Affairs Committee, and a number of those are here, members are here today as well.
Thank you. Don?
My name is Don Horton. I'm Senior Vice President of Global Government Relations and Public Policy for LabCorp. LabCorp is a leading global life sciences company offering comprehensive clinical laboratory services as well as comprehensive drug development support services. And our 60,000 colleagues in 60 countries are passionate about improving health and improving care. We test over 500,000 specimens every day using both FDA cleared or approved test kits and laboratory developed tests. Through the American Clinical Laboratory Association, through the Personalized Medicine Coalition, through the larger coalition of diagnostics reform that Susan and Julie have put together, through the Diagnostic Test Working Group, and directly through our own direct outreach to Congress and the FDA. I have been engaged in the discussion of LDT oversight for over 15 years now, and look forward to advancing that discussion today.
Great. And Laura, I know you're down there. I can't see you. But.
I'm down here. Hi, Laura Lassiter. I lead diagnostic regulatory policy and coverage and reimbursement policy at Friends of Cancer Research. We are a science policy organization that represents the needs of cancer patients in drug development. Specifically, we drive collaboration between experts and stakeholders across healthcare sectors to advance the science, policies, and regulations that are needed to speed life-saving development of life-saving therapies. Our policy focuses involve development of policy that supports innovation while also ensuring patient access. So our interest in diagnostic regulatory reform really stemmed out of our work in drug development and specifically targeted therapies, because we realized that any policies that are designed to advance the speed of innovation for drugs must be developed in tandem with those policies that increase the rate of innovation for the companion diagnostics that are necessary for their indications. So we think that these are two policies that really must go hand in hand. We also see it as a patient access topic, because patients don't just need access to a drug. They need access to the right drug, and that's dependent entirely on an accurate test result. So we've been active on this conversation since, I think, our first white paper was published in 2012, and we've been actively working with stakeholders from FDA the Diagnostic Working Group with AdvaMed and ACLA over the years, and talking to the Hill staff to think about ways that and developing legislation in a thoughtful manner that will not only ensure appropriate oversight, but not impose the excessive regulatory burdens that will stifle innovation. I should add that in addition to Friends, ACS-CAN and Longevity have also been great partners as we've continued to engage the Hill on this topic. So some of the priorities that Friends has been focusing on as we've engaged in this legislation discussion is thinking about adaptable policies that will continue to support innovation of companion diagnostics specifically, but diagnostics in general, and maintain that rate of innovation in line with the therapeutics which they test for and indicate. So some of the specific topics that we think are important are things like establishing regulatory pathways that will align the development timelines for both, things like breakthrough therapy designation or breakthrough device designation and fast track. And along that same line, we've been thinking about we sort of put out a plan a couple of years ago thinking about what we called a pre-specified modification plan, where basically we think that a manufacturer should be able to, or a diagnostic developer should be able to approach the FDA with a plan of, this is our test, these are the changes that we anticipate occurring down the line, and how can we pre-specify the validation plan that we would implement for that ahead of time, not requiring us to come back to the FDA later. There's something like that in the ballot. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a bit, but this is something more broad that we think is important and would apply more importantly to companion diagnostics as well. So those are a couple of things. We are currently, we've organized a working group that will discuss a policy that's developed from the working group at our annual meeting in November to think about group labeling of companion diagnostics, and in this vein of keeping diagnostics and therapies developing together. The thinking would be that we want to better align the discrepancies that we're starting to see in oncology specifically, where multiple drugs that target the same biomarker in a class there are also multiple companion diagnostics for all of those drugs, and the discrepancy between which diagnostic do you use for which therapy, and we think that something that's more amendable like group labeling will help to expedite and reduce some of the confusion in those issues. So those are some of the topics that we think are particularly important, but I'll stop there.
Thanks, Laura. Okay, we have a little under 30 minutes and 4 questions to get through. We're trying to make this an interactive panel format. We'll leave about 5 minutes at the end for questions. So to answer those 4 questions, we've assigned leads to them. So we'll go quickly down and start with Julie and Susan. How will the VALID Act change current oversight landscape for diagnostics, including LDTs, from your perspective?
Want me to go first, Susan? Well, you are sitting there.
Yeah, here we go again. So I'm going to talk about comprehensive diagnostic reform sort of generally, as well as VALID specifically. I mean, the answer kind of obviously from the laboratory perspective is that it would result in sweeping changes, right? It's a fundamental shift in how laboratory developed tests would be regulated. And there's really great potential there. There's real opportunity to get to bringing the very best testing and making sure that patients have robust access. And if you look back again to sort of where we've come from and where we are, the current VALID discussion draft includes some of the provisions that are really critical to the success comprehensive reform. A few examples. It recognizes that there should be a distinct diagnostic specifics framework. I know not part of any current regulatory pathway. There is a provision including grandfathering, recognizing that there has to be a reasonable transition period, shifting to a new system, pre-certification, and a topic I think that there remain a lot of questions about, but there's real interest in there. Valid recognizes that you really have to be careful about avoiding duplication, and that CLIA, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but is really laboratory operations as opposed to regulation. So those things are all there, and that's really promising. The challenge, of course, is in the details. And ACLA spends a great deal of its time on Valid and in our advocacy in general on those details. So there are questions about that transition policy as an example. Would there be a period of time where LDTs would potentially be under the device regulation? Grandfathering is there, but there's some strengthening. There also needs to be clarification in there. Again, what is the role for CLIA? What is potentially the role for this new framework? So the good news is it's all there. Yeah. But there is much work to do. It's one of the reasons that as part of our advocacy, what we're requesting is kind of getting all the people around the table. And there's a good reflection of the people who should be at the table on this panel. It's broader than obviously just our organizations. That's got to include the FDA too, as well as the Hill. And if our goal is in fact to advance a successful legislative solution, I think that's an important and critical next step.
Absolutely. Susan?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of Julie's points. And while AdvaMedDx members, IVD manufacturers, currently bring their tests through the FDA, so we are regulated entities, the Valid framework really contemplates a really different set of pathways from what we're accustomed to right now. So it'd be a different kind of transition, but there certainly would be a transition for IVDs. And so we're working to understand a little bit more about what that timeline would be, what the opportunity to really sort of weigh in a formal notice and comment type period would be. So transition is something that we're really mindful of as well, and appreciating that our laboratory partners would be going through a transition of a different character. That's important when we think about the length of the transition, what it means for patient access to tests and innovation. That transitionary period of time is really critical, so we're focused on that. I also quite agree with Julie that the Valid framework and discussion draft has a lot of promise in it. I think it really does hold the right elements to be able to ensure that there is that balance of innovation with ensuring that you're getting, as Laura said, you've got the analytical and clinical validity, you have the confidence, as patients and family members and the like, particularly as tests become, more and more high risk and complicated. We want to ensure that there is that confidence in this framework. Pre-certification in particular, we do think holds a lot of promise. In a lot of ways, it's the keystone of the Valid framework. We think there are some areas where we would like some clarity. We'd like a broadening of the scope of pre-certification. We'd like to ensure that it is more predictable. I mean, certainly predictability is really essential for diagnostics manufacturers, of course. But we think that what is present in pre-cert and what could become out of pre-certification would really allow for there to be some important policy changes to encourage innovation. Laura mentioned or referred to the notions of change protocols. It's, for example, as a pre-certified entity under Valid, you could bring in a test, a representative test that would be part of a suite of tests and have a full review of that representative test. And then at that time, as part of the agreement within your pre-certification, understand that there are change protocols that can be made after your test is on the market, you've developed experience with it, you've already had that pre-cert dialogue with FDA, and you can adhere to that previously agreed upon change protocol. So you're able to innovate given the experience you have with clinicians providing the test to patients without going back into the agency for a 510K, as would be the case currently. So again, I really think the right elements are there. It holds terrific promise. We're really eager to work with all the stakeholders here and on the Hill and the agency to make these improvements to the package and to secure final passage of the legislation.
Great. Tara, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, follow up to that because I know we're pressed for time. I agree with some of the things that Julie and Susan have said, particularly find the pre-cert aspect intriguing. I think one aspect of where they develop within valid buckets of tests or their risk categories remains a little unclear. So for those of you not, in the weeds with valid, one thing that's distinct from other proposals is that there's only 2 risk categories and a pre-certification program. And I think a lot of us have gathered that the majority of those tests would fall, a lot of the tests would fall within the pre-certification category, which kind of aligns itself to a moderate risk, but there aren't clear lines from our perspective in digesting valid where tests would fall. And I think that's a key aspect in understanding that before we move forward there. So that's one thing I just wanted to follow up on.
Great, thanks. And Tara, one of the things that Julie mentioned related to CLIA is it's very focused on lab operations, and a lot of your time on the Hill has been trying to communicate what that actually entails. How's that going, and how do you all, both Tara and Julie, think that the policymakers are addressing the role of CMS and CLIA?
Yeah, I think, AMP has always advocated for a CLIA modernization-based approach to addressing changes to the oversight system for laboratory-developed testing procedures. We are frustrated that with regards to valid and the current main proposals on the Hill that CMS has not been engaged. We will continue to advocate that they be engaged for a couple of reasons. One, we want to make sure, and Julie and Susan have communicated this, that any proposal, the time is taken up front to get it right now. I think PAMA is an example of a kind of what we're trying to do to fix, something that was rushed through, and no one wants that to happen with this. Secondly, CLIA, even if valid were passed tomorrow, CLIA is still a main component to how laboratories are regulated. And so ensuring clear lines and knowing where the duplication lies with invalid is key to do that now. And so we will continue to engage with the Hill to advocate that CMS be involved, to advocate with CMS that CMS be involved, and to advocate just to FDA that they continue to engage with their colleagues. We're not satisfied with a TA that, with CMS saying it's okay, we, let FDA do its thing, because ultimately there will have to be a conversation, and we want that to be now rather than later.
Yeah. Julie?
I think Tara's response was really comprehensive and wholeheartedly agree, so not a lot to add. CMS and CLIA do need to be at the table. This is TA that comes from HHS, so you've got FDA and CMS there, and you really do need to have that input, very, very important. Just getting a little bit more specificity, again, back to valid. Remember, here we are with the good stuff, and here's the details we got to kind of work on. I would say avoiding that duplication falls into that bucket as well. Again, the recognition that there are sort of separate and distinct areas, and you don't want to have that duplication, but you do see in valid, again, particularly with the quality system requirements, you've got some overlap into regulations dealing with laboratory operations, dealing with purchasing controls and personnel and things like that. That's really important. It is those details, again, they're going to make for a successful framework.
Absolutely. The next question's for Dawn and for Susan. How would increased regulatory and oversight activities at the FDA, at the FDA impact the diagnostics industry? We'll start with Dawn.
Well, as Julie mentioned, the devil's in the details. I personally think there's a lot of work yet to be done on the Valid Act discussion draft to get it to something that can be enacted. It was essentially the FDA's counter offer to the earlier Diagnostic Accuracy and Innovation Act discussion draft that was consistent with all of our legislative principles and objectives. The VALID Act, unfortunately, does not check off all those boxes. So I think we're going to need to pull it back between those two drafts to get something that's ultimately enactable. In terms of impact, the more onerous the final legislation is for laboratories, the greater the impact is going to be. I think it will also vary from lab to lab by their business model, as well as perhaps even their geographic footprint. There's a great deal of diversity among laboratories. You got hospital labs, you got physician office labs, you got independent labs, large labs, small labs, urban labs, rural labs, some that offer 2 or 3 tests that are LDTs, some of which offer thousands of tests, many FDA cleared or approved, some LDTs. So depending on your test mix, the impact of the new legislation will have a differential impact. And for those labs who are used to pre-market submissions because they offer tests to New York residents, the transition will not be as significant for them as it will be for those who don't have a New York presence and have not experienced the New York State Department of Health pre-market review process. I think beyond that, it really comes down to a lot of additional work for labs and some difficult decisions. So the work comes in terms of learning brand new vocabulary with an entirely new layer of regulatory oversight in addition to the ongoing CLIA regulations. A lot of new SOPs are going to have to be written, a lot of training of employees. It's going to take a long time. And in addition to that, I think labs are going to have to make some difficult choices about the tests that they offer. Again, depending on how difficult it is for labs, depending on how the final legislation comes out, there may be perfectly valid tests that are not offered for patient care because it's economically infeasible to do so. And that, I think, is the part of the equation that a lot of policymakers are missing. There's been a lot of focus on what happens if the test is wrong. Well, what happens if the test is actually right and you can't get it on the market because it's not economically feasible to do so? And so that's why it's so critically important for us to achieve a balance between ensuring patients are protected through analytically and clinically valid tests, but making sure that they have access to valid tests as well.
Great, thanks. Susan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, for AdvaMedDx members, IVD manufacturers who, currently bring their products through the FDA, they're accustomed to being regulated, but under the current regulatory framework. So there will be a transition that they'll need to go through. So, will IVD manufacturers find the pre-certification program, for example, as advantageous as we hope that they will if we can improve that draft? That's a key question, really. So there are any number of pathways that a manufacturer could go through that's contemplated by the valid draft. Will pre-cert achieve the promise that we think it has? And I think that's a great focus among IVD manufacturers right now. Can we get it right? Will the scope be right? Will the character be right? Will there be advantages? Will this be good for my business? But I think the other reality too is I think Don's comments were quite thoughtful in how the laboratory landscape changes as a result of the transition into a valid type framework. If enacted, really has a lot to do with how IVD manufacturers will then function as well. Don mentioned, what will patient access be like to tests? So certain tests that are offered now as LDTs may no longer be offered. Will IVDs, be in that space? So there will be some change to the market, most certainly, and part of it will be a reaction to how the laboratories accommodate a new framework.
Great, thanks. And the last question is for Laura, and I think you touched on this a little bit in your introduction, but building on Susan and Don's comments about the impact of tests actually being available and not making their way to patients, I imagine that's something that Friends is also cognizant of. I mean, what impact would Valid in its current form have on impact to patient care and generally just the work that you've been doing over the last few years in diagnostics reform? How are you balancing the two?
Yeah, it's an ongoing, discussion. I think that there's areas to improve on Valid, but, overall, I think that uniform diagnostic regulation and oversight will have a very positive impact for patients. And I think the key word there is uniform, which is what Valid is attempting to do. Friends published a market analysis back in 2016 where we looked at testing rates for patients with non-small cell lung cancer. And what we found was significant variability depending on the patient, the gene that was being tested for, but between 50% of patients for ALK alterations and up to 87% of patients who are being tested for EGFR were being tested with LDTs. Now, we are seeing some of an uptake. Friends is we're working on a manuscript now to publish a subsequent analysis that we did, led by Menace and Wempe, where we're seeing an uptake in FDA-approved use of FDA-approved tests in more recent years. Some of that probably due to the fact that there's more companion diagnostics on the market, FDA-approved, during the timeline that we were looking at for the second analysis. But we think that does also reflect some of the values that physicians see when ordering tests, that they value FDA approval. And so getting back to this topic of uniformity, having patients that are receiving 50% FDA approved versus LDTs, begs for a more uniform approach to regulation to ensure that they are equally validated across the board. I don't mean to imply that the patients that are receiving LDTs are receiving bad tests, and I want to make that very clear. In many cases, these patients are receiving their tests from very highly reputable and excellent cancer centers. And in some cases, those tests may actually be better than the FDA-approved tests. But the problem is that we have no way of knowing that because there isn't a single regulatory review for all tests. And patient access also demands transparency. And I think that is one of the key components for patients that we want to ensure, is that patients can know that all tests are being validated equally, and that they can have the assurance of access to that information if they want it. So ultimately, we think that, as I mentioned before, patients' access, not just any drug, but to the right drug, is dependent on receiving an accurate test result. And if patients are receiving uniformity across the board, then that we think will ensure greater patient impact in a positive way. I guess I would just sum that up by quoting our infamous founder, Alan Siegel, who often will say, that we have to do this. This is important to patients, and we have to get it right.
Thank you. Does anyone else on the panel have anything they want to say about patient access or issues related to transparency of tests that don't necessarily go through FDA review, a single pathway?
So the only, I think really appreciate being on the panel, and what's really positive also is that we actually talk to each other other than just today. We have. I think in my time working on this issue, which pales in comparisons to Don's, that's something that I have noticed as a greater discussion with stakeholders, and I think it's important. I think the other thing, one area that I think we didn't talk about, and there's probably a lot of things we didn't talk about, it is important to have, that there's confidence in all tests, for certainly for patients and clinicians. But when we think about tests that are, FDA test kits or LDTs, the other thing to think about is there a reasonable regulatory path forward to improve your test? Mm-hmm. Because the innovation and the changes that happen now with LDTs is groundbreaking, and there's the ability to keep improving and keep changing. And if you don't have a system that allows for that, in fact, sort of discourages it. Gosh, what do I have to do to get through? How much is it going to cost? Mm-hmm. I think that this is going to work better for this subset of patients, but I can't get through it. That's certainly the last thing in the world that you want for, in the push for personalized medicine. Absolutely. So I just want to add that comment into the conversation as well.
I think it's really important to get that balance right, too. I certainly agree, right? We want, as Laura said, I think that transparency is important, understand what the universe of tests are and really get that balance right to ensure that you've got a predictable regulatory framework that can foster and encourage innovation and embrace it. It's the right thing to do for patients. So we're eager to find that right balance.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Please join me in thanking the panelists.